Hey, you can't be inside the tape. Step back.
I'm working the scene.
Working how? I don't see a uniform.
I'm a detective.
Then where's your supervisor? We don't need civilians wandering through evidence.
I'm not a civilian.
Then show me something. Badge, ID, now.
I'm gonna lift my coat.
Do it slow.
Here, satisfied?
That doesn't mean you ignore perimeter protocol.
I didn't ignore anything.
Imagine spending 22 years building a career that most people only dream about. 22 years of late nights, cold case files stacked ceiling high on a desk nobody else wanted to sit at. 22 years of earning every single promotion through blood, sweat, and an almost obsessive commitment to justice. 22 years of putting the worst of humanity behind bars. Murderers, traffickers, predators. People who thought they'd never see the inside of a courtroom. Now imagine that on an ordinary Tuesday evening, none of that matters. Not the gold shield clipped to your belt. Not the 17 commendations hanging in a frame above your desk. Not the 2 decades of service that turned you from a rookie patrol officer into one of the most respected homicide detectives in the entire Metropolitan Division. None of it matters. Because a man in a uniform took one look at you and decided, before you ever opened your mouth, that you didn't belong there. His name isn't important yet. But his actions set off a chain of events that would crack open a conversation this country has been desperately trying to avoid. Detective Darnell Washington, 14-year homicide veteran. Lead investigator on one of the city's most high-profile murder cases. Standing on the corner of his own active crime scene, yellow tape flapping in the November wind, forensics on their knees in the gutter. His case, his jurisdiction, his investigation. And a responding patrol officer looked him dead in the eyes and told him to get behind the tape. Before we continue, what city are you watching from? If this is your first time here, support the channel by liking and subscribing. Stories like this need to be heard. And with your help, we can make sure these events don't go unheard. Because what happened next, nobody saw coming. Not the officer, not the department, not the city. And by the time it was over, somebody was going to lose a whole lot more than their pride. To understand why this story matters, you have to understand who Darnell Washington is. Not who he is in a press release. Not the sanitized bio on the department's website. Who he actually is. In the marrow of the job, in the culture of the precinct, in the language spoken by people who work homicide for a living. Darnell grew up in the Eastfield neighborhood of the city, a working-class community that sat somewhere between forgotten and deliberately neglected on the municipal priority list. Crack sidewalks, underfunded schools, a rec center that closed every winter because the heating system hadn't been repaired since 1994. The kind of neighborhood where ambition was either celebrated like a miracle or quietly discouraged because people were afraid to watch you fail. Darnell's mother, Evelyn, worked double shifts as a hospital administrator. His father, a retired transit worker named Gerald, coached Little League on weekends and spent his evenings reading. There were books everywhere in that house: history, law, biography. Gerald Washington believed, deeply and without irony, that knowledge was the only currency that couldn't be taken from you. Darnell absorbed all of it. He graduated from Roosevelt High School in the top 8% of his class, went to state on an academic partial scholarship, double majoring in criminal justice and sociology. His thesis, a 40-page analysis of clearance rate disparities in urban homicide investigations, was cited in a law review article 2 years after he graduated. He joined the force at 23. Not because he romanticized police work, not because he'd grown up idolizing cops. In Eastfield, that would have been a complicated thing to admit. He joined because he understood something that took most people years to articulate: that the criminal justice system was going to exist whether he participated in it or not. And he would rather be inside it, fighting for the people it routinely overlooked, than standing outside it, watching injustice go unanswered. His first 5 years on patrol, he worked the overnight shift in the 9th District, arguably the most demanding assignment in the city. He responded to over 300 calls in his first year alone. He was cited for bravery twice before he ever made detective. There's a story, well known inside the precinct, never formally documented, about the night he talked a man off a parking structure ledge for 2 hours in sub-zero temperatures, staying on the phone with the man's daughter the entire time so she could hear her father's voice coming back to steady ground. He made detective at 29, the youngest in his cohort. By the time he hit his mid-30s, Darnell Washington was working homicide, the unit that other detectives called the last stop, the cases that nobody else could crack, the victims who'd been waiting the longest for someone to care enough. Cold cases, active investigations, multi-jurisdictional nightmares that required the kind of patience and intellectual endurance most people couldn't sustain for a week, let alone a career. 14 years in homicide, a clearance rate that sat 12 points above the unit average, 43 murder convictions, all standing on appeal. He was known among prosecutors as the detective who built airtight cases, among colleagues as the guy who never let a case die, among the families of victims, the ones who'd sat in too many waiting rooms, hoping someone would care, as the person who finally showed up and stayed. He had a gold shield. He had a department-issued unmarked vehicle. He had a tailored charcoal overcoat he wore to every scene because, as he once told a rookie, how you show up to a scene tells the victim's family what you think their life was worth. He was, by every measurable standard, exactly where he was supposed to be, which makes what happened on the corner of Granger and 5th that November evening not just outrageous, it makes it a case study. It was 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in early November. The temperature had dropped sharply in the last 2 hours, one of those sudden autumn plunges that catches the city off guard when the afternoon sun vanishes and the wind coming off the river cuts through your jacket like it has a personal grievance against you. The corner of Granger Avenue and 5th Street sits at the eastern edge of what the city planners call the mixed-use corridor, a polished phrase for a neighborhood in the middle of a complicated, contested transformation. On one side of the block, a row of aging brownstones, most of them still occupied by families who'd been there for 30 years. On the other, a glass-faced co-working space and a boutique coffee shop that charged $14 for a latte and had a 6-month waitlist for private memberships. Two worlds, one intersection. And tonight, that intersection was a crime scene. A 41-year-old man named Trevor Okafor had been found at 6:12 p.m., collapsed against the iron fence that edged the brownstone at 412 Granger. A single gunshot wound to the chest. No wallet, no phone. A broken watch, still ticking, on his left wrist. Uniformed first responders had established a perimeter. Forensics had arrived at 6:38 and were working the immediate area. Bagging shell casings, photographing blood spatter, measuring distances. An ME assistant had crouched next to the body. A small forensics tent had been erected at the northeast corner to protect trace evidence from the wind. Darnell had caught the call on his way back from a follow-up interview across town. He'd been working 16 hours already, not unusual for him in the middle of an active case. He parked his unmarked on 5th, grabbed his kit from the back seat, and ducked under the yellow tape with the particular stride of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. Purposeful, measured, already mentally mapping the scene before his feet touched the pavement. He was wearing the charcoal overcoat. He had his gold shield clipped to his belt, visible. His department lanyard, with photo ID, was looped around his neck, as required by protocol at multi-agency scenes. He was the ranking detective on this case. His name was on the incident report. His authorization code had been used to access the scene file 40 minutes earlier. He belonged there more than almost anyone else on that street. But he was a black man in an expensive coat, in a neighborhood that was, in the eyes of some, in the middle of becoming something that didn't include him. And that, for one particular officer, was apparently enough of a data point to draw a conclusion from. Officer Brian Caulfield had been on the force for 6 years. He was 31 years old, assigned to the 3rd District, and had been dispatched to Granger and 5th as part of the supplemental perimeter detail. The additional uniformed officers brought in to manage crowd control and maintain the outer boundary of the crime scene. Not investigators, not case personnel, support. His job, specifically, was to make sure no unauthorized individuals crossed the outer tape line. By every account, from witnesses, from body cam footage that would later become the center of a firestorm, Officer Caulfield had been vocal all evening, animated. The kind of officer who filled silence with authority, whether or not that authority was needed or warranted. Multiple witnesses would later describe him as agitated and on edge. Though crime scenes are, by their nature, high-tension environments, and not every display of intensity is itself a red flag. What happened next, however, was not intensity. It was something else entirely. Darnell had been at the scene approximately 4 minutes. He'd made contact with the lead forensics tech, crouched at the body, and begun a preliminary visual assessment, standard procedure for an arriving homicide detective. He'd spoken briefly with the first responding officer who had logged the initial call. Everything was moving with the efficient, choreographed rhythm of a practiced homicide team. And then Officer Caulfield approached from the perimeter. He was walking fast, shoulders squared, the particular body language of someone who has already decided on a course of action before arriving at the destination. Hey, sir." Darnell looked up from his crouch near the body. "Sir, I need you to step back behind the tape." There was no question in Caulfield's voice, no inquiry, no attempt to establish who Darnell was before issuing the command. Just an instruction, firm, clipped, final. Delivered to a man who was actively working the scene. Darnell straightened slowly. He had been through enough in 22 years to recognize this moment for exactly what it was. He had trained himself, by necessity, by survival, by the particular calculus that Black professionals in authority positions learn early and carry always, to respond to these moments with deliberate calm. "Detective Washington," he said, pointing to the gold shield on his belt. "Homicide, this is my scene." A reasonable person, upon receiving that information, delivered that clearly and calmly, would have paused, would have checked the shield, would have perhaps glanced at the department lanyard hanging in plain sight around Darnell's neck, would have said, "My apologies, detective," and returned to their post. Officer Caulfield did not do any of those things. "I'm going to need you to move, sir. This is an active crime scene." The air between them shifted. Every person within earshot, 3 forensics technicians, 2 uniformed officers from other districts, a crime scene photographer mid-shot, went still. Darnell kept his voice level. He had seen this before, and he knew that how you respond in the first 30 seconds either diffuses or escalates. He chose deliberate, unambiguous clarity. "I'm the lead detective on this homicide investigation. My name is on the case file. You can verify that with your sergeant or with dispatch." He held his shield up now, direct and unhurried, giving Caulfield every opportunity to course correct. "Detective Darnell Washington, Homicide Division." Caulfield looked at the shield, and then, and this is the part that everyone who was there remembered, he looked back up at Darnell, and something in his expression didn't change. "I don't recognize you," Caulfield said. "I'm going to need you to come with me and verify your identity before I can let you continue." The temperature on that corner dropped another 10 degrees, though the thermometer had nothing to do with it. Let's pause here for a moment, because what Caulfield said, "I don't recognize you," is worth examining in granular, uncomfortable detail. Because what does it mean exactly for an officer working perimeter support at a crime scene to require personal recognition before acknowledging a detective's credentials? That is not a departmental protocol. That is not a professional standard. There is no policy anywhere in the procedural manual of any metropolitan police department in this country that instructs officers to recognize detectives by face rather than by the shield and identification they are displaying. What Caulfield was doing, whether he understood it consciously or not, was substituting his personal unfamiliarity for institutional verification. He was saying, in the most functionally revealing way possible, "I know who I expect to see here, and you don't match that expectation." Darnell understood this. He didn't say it. Not yet. But he understood it with the bone-deep clarity of a man who has spent decades navigating rooms that weren't built to expect him. "I don't need your recognition," Darnell said. Still calm, still measured. But there was something underneath the calm now. Not anger, not quite. A kind of quiet, studied precision. Like a surgeon. "I need you to look at my shield, look at my department ID, and resume your assigned post." Caulfield crossed his arms. "Protocol is protocol. If you're on this scene, I need it verified through my sergeant." "Then call your sergeant," Darnell said. "Right now. I'll wait." And here is where things became genuinely surreal. Because Caulfield didn't call his sergeant, not immediately. Instead, he did something that witnesses would describe in multiple subsequent statements as unbelievable. He reached for his radio, then stopped, then looked at Darnell with an expression that one forensics technician would later describe as like he was deciding whether to believe his own eyes. There are layers of psychology operating in a moment like this. There is the initial bias, the snap judgment formed before a single word was spoken. There is the ego investment, the refusal to course correct because doing so would require admitting the initial judgment was wrong. And then there is the worst layer, the doubling down, the decision to escalate rather than retreat, because retreat feels, to a certain kind of person, like defeat. Caulfield made a different calculation. He took a step toward Darnell, not aggressive, but loaded, the kind of step that says, "I am not finished asserting authority here." "Sir, I need you to step away from the body." The scene photographer, a 12-year veteran named Adriana Reyes, stopped shooting entirely. She stood up from her crouch. She would later tell investigators that she could not believe what she was witnessing. "Everybody knew who Detective Washington was," she said. "His name had been on the call-out. We'd all been briefed. I kept thinking, why doesn't this officer just radio dispatch? It would have taken 45 seconds. 45 seconds. Instead, this had now been going on for nearly 4 minutes. 4 minutes of a lead homicide detective being held at the perimeter of his own crime scene by a patrol officer who refused to accept the credentials directly in front of his face. And the whole time, somewhere behind the yellow tape, a crowd was forming. Phones were coming out. Eyes were watching. Sergeant Diane Okonkwo arrived at 7:03 p.m. She had been on the far side of the perimeter, managing a traffic redirect when a forensics tech, frustrated enough to break from the unspoken bystander silence, had quietly radioed her to come to the center of the scene. Sergeant Okonkwo was a 17-year veteran. She knew Darnell Washington. She had worked with him on 3 prior cases. She knew his voice, his build, his charcoal overcoat. She walked onto the scene, assessed the situation in approximately 2 seconds, and turned to face Officer Caulfield with the particular expression of a senior officer who has just discovered something profoundly embarrassing. "Officer Caulfield." "Sergeant, I was attempting to verify. This is Detective Washington." Her voice was flat. "He is the lead investigator on this case. His name was on the scene briefing that went out to every officer on this detail 40 minutes ago." She paused. 1 beat. 2. "Did you read the briefing?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing on that corner. Caulfield opened his mouth, closed it. Did you check his shield?" "I did, Sergeant, but what, officer?" Nothing. There was nothing to say that wasn't going to make it worse. Every officer on that scene was watching now. The forensics team, the ME assistant, Adriana Reyes, who had quietly, professionally resumed taking photographs, though some of them, from this point forward, were not of the body. Sergeant Okonkwo turned to Darnell. "Detective Washington, I sincerely apologize for this disruption. Please continue." Darnell looked at Caulfield for one long, quiet moment. He did not say what he was thinking. He did not need to. He nodded at Sergeant Okonkwo, turned back to the scene, and went back to work. Because there was a dead man on the pavement who needed justice. And Darnell Washington had never once let anything stop him from delivering it. But 3 people had already been recording on their phones. And by morning, the whole city was going to have questions. The first video hit social media at 9:22 p.m. that same night. It was 17 seconds long. shot from behind the yellow tape on the north side of the perimeter by a 24-year-old grad student named Kezia Morales, who had been walking back from the library when she stopped at the edge of the crowd and pulled out her phone. The footage was grainy, November darkness, streetlight orange, the kind of compressed video quality you get when a phone camera is pushed to its limits. But it was clear enough, unmistakably, undeniably clear enough. You could see the gold shield, you could see the department lanyard, you could see Darnell standing at the body, measured and professional, while Caulfield, chest puffed, body language stiff, issued instructions that had no business being issued. The caption Kezia wrote above the video was 8 words long. Cop just tried to remove the detective from his own crime scene. By midnight, the video had 40,000 views. By 6 a.m. the next morning, it had crossed 2 million. By noon, it was the top trending topic in the country. The comments were a mixture of fury, recognition, and the particular exhaustion of people who had seen some version of this before. The fury was loud and immediate, people tagging media organizations, calling for accountability, demanding to know the officer's name. The recognition was quieter, more unsettling. Black professionals across every field, in comment after comment, saying some version of this happens to me too, just with less of an audience. A black doctor said it happened to her in a hospital she worked at. A black architect said it happened to him at a construction site he was managing. A black professor said a security guard had questioned him outside his own office building. Same story, different uniforms, different industries, same fundamental assumption operating underneath all of it. But Darnell's story had something the others often didn't. It had the gold shield. It had the sergeant's response. It had the crime scene, the credentials, and, crucially, 2 other pieces of footage that emerged in the days that followed. The first was Officer Caulfield's body cam footage, released under department policy after the incident was formally logged. It captured 5 full minutes and 40 seconds of the confrontation. Better angle, better audio, every word preserved. You could hear Darnell's voice, low and careful. You could hear Caulfield's. You could hear the moment Sergeant Okonkwo arrived. And you could hear, in the background, the particular silence of experienced law enforcement professionals watching something deeply wrong unfold and not knowing, in real time, how to stop it without making it worse. The second was the precinct's internal security footage from the digital login system, which showed, with a timestamp, that Darnell's badge number and credentials had been entered into the scene management system at 6:44 p.m., 14 minutes before Caulfield confronted him, meaning Caulfield's claim of needing to verify credentials wasn't just a bad call in the moment. It was verifiably, documentably false. The information had been available to every officer on that detail before the confrontation began. The city's Police Reform Oversight Board convened a special session. New protocols were proposed for multi-agency scene deployments, including mandatory digital credential verification available to all perimeter officers, mandatory scene briefing acknowledgement, not just distribution, and an escalation procedure for credential disputes that bypassed the individual officer and went directly to command. 3 months later, 2 of those proposals were formally adopted. The $3.8 million lawsuit was settled out of court 11 months later. The settlement amount was not disclosed, but Patricia Delacroix told reporters, with a composure that contained multitudes, that her client was satisfied with the outcome and committed to ensuring that what happened to him would, to the extent possible, not happen to the next person. Let's talk about what we're actually looking at here, because it's easy to frame this story as a story about one bad officer on one cold night at one intersection. It's easy, and it's wrong. Officer Caulfield was not some isolated anomaly, a single rogue actor in an otherwise pristine system. He was, in the most uncomfortable way, a product of a system that has never fully, honestly, completely reckoned with who it was built to see and who it was built to question. Think about the architecture of that moment on Granger Avenue. Darnell Washington was not in plainclothes sneaking onto a scene. He was visibly credentialed. He was on the briefing list. His authorization was in the system. He was actively working, crouched at the body, communicating with forensics, doing the job. Every visible marker of authority and legitimacy was present and accounted for. And still, the assumption ran faster than the evidence. That's the part we have to sit with. Not the isolated behavior of one officer, but the speed at which the assumption traveled, before any information was gathered, before any verification was attempted, before a single professional courtesy was extended. The assumption arrived first. And here's the most destabilizing part of all this. The part that makes this story genuinely, systemically important. Darnell Washington had the gold shield. What about the black professionals who don't? What about the black homeowner who a neighbor calls the police on? The black doctor who gets questioned by hospital security at his own hospital? The black architect who gets detained at a building he designed? The black executive in the parking garage of his own company? Those people don't have a gold shield to hold up. Those people don't have a Sergeant Okonkwo to walk in and deliver the corrective in front of everyone. Those people often don't have body cam footage, or a crime scene photographer taking pictures, or a crowd behind the tape with their phones out. Darnell's story went viral because it had all of those things, because the reversal was dramatic and public and well documented, because the credentials were irrefutable and the behavior was undeniable. But the version of this story that doesn't go viral? It happens every single day. It happens in boardrooms and hospitals and university campuses and corporate lobbies. It happens in neighborhoods that are changing, which is a polite way of saying that someone has decided certain people no longer fit the aesthetic of the space. It happens in the ordinary, unremarkable fabric of daily life, in 1,000 small moments of presumption and dismissal that never generate a press conference or a lawsuit or a trending hashtag. And we have to ask ourselves, with the kind of uncomfortable honesty this story demands, what do we actually do about that? Is body cam footage an accountability mechanism, or is it a lottery? Does a story only matter when the documentation is perfect and the reversal is dramatic? What happens when there's no sergeant to walk in? What happens when the person being questioned doesn't have a gold shield, doesn't have a lanyard, doesn't have an airtight paper trail that makes the injustice undeniable even to its perpetrators? What happens then? Here's another question worth sitting with. Officer Caulfield had been on the force for 6 years. In those 6 years, he had received training. He had passed evaluations. He had been deemed, by every institutional measure available, fit for duty. He was not an outlier in any documented sense before this night, which means the system that deployed him on that corner had no mechanism in place to catch what was about to happen before it happened. And if the system couldn't catch it before Darnell Washington, with 22 years and a gold shield and a department lanyard and his name on the briefing, then who is the system actually protecting? The coalition statement from black law enforcement professionals named it directly. They talked about what it costs professionally and personally to walk into spaces every day carrying the weight of having to prove legitimacy that nobody questions for anyone else. The constant calibration, the deliberate management of tone, posture, and emotion under conditions that don't demand it from everyone equally. The way that energy, the energy spent simply establishing that you belong in a room, is energy that cannot simultaneously go toward the work. Darnell Washington spent 4 to 5 minutes on that corner, defending his right to be there. 4 to 5 minutes from a man with a clearance rate 12 points above the unit average. 4 to 5 minutes from the lead investigator on a murder case. 4 to 5 minutes from Trevor Okafor's best chance at justice. In 43 murder convictions, the families of 43 victims can tell you what those minutes are worth. That's the story of Detective Darnell Washington, a man who carried a gold shield into a hostile moment and came out the other side with his integrity fully intact, even as the system that should have protected him let him down in front of everyone watching. If this story hit you, if you've lived some version of this, witnessed some version of this, or know someone who has, drop it in the comments. This conversation doesn't happen without you keeping it alive. Share this one, not for the algorithm. Because there are people in your life who need to hear this story, and they're not going to find it on their own. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. Every week, we bring you the stories that the headlines bury. the ones where the full picture only makes sense when someone takes the time to tell it right. Darnell Washington went back to work. The question is whether we do too. You.